Today is January 19th, 2024. My name is Alexia Orengo Green. I am interviewing Carlos Katz on behalf of the USC Shoah Foundation. The interview is taking place in Edison, New Jersey, in the United States. The language of the interview will be English. Please state your name.
Carlos Katz.
And what was your name at birth?
Carl Katz.
And does it have any significance or meaning within your family?
I never asked my parents as to why I got the name of Carl Katz, but that's the way it was. So it was changed to Carlos because we were living in South America and all my friends called me Carlos instead of Carl.
And when were you born?
I was born in August 18, 1934.
And how old are you today?
Almost 90 years.
And what was the name of the town you were born, and in what country?
I was born in Germany, in a town called Nentershausen. It's located in the center of Germany.
And what do you remember about Nenterhausen?
Oh, well, I have visited the town in my adult life a couple of times, so my remembrance is not only maybe when I was a child, but when I was already an adult. No, it's a little town. At the time when I was born, I understand there were like 700 inhabitants. Today it has been expanded, and it's a couple of thousand people in the area. For my years before we left Germany, I remember only very little. I left at the age of 6. So I do have some things I remember, but there are not too many.
And can you tell me about your father?
Well, my father, his name was Willie, and he was a shoemaker. By the time we got born, he was already close to 40 years old, and he actually participated in the First World War, which, as I will mention later, helped him. And he comes from a family where being a shoemaker passed from father to the oldest child. So we learned that our family lived in Nentershausen over 200 years, and there was always a shoemaker in the family or in related activities. My older brother, he used to tell me all the time, if we wouldn't have left Germany, I would be a shoemaker today. But he became an engineer instead. So my father and his father had a shoe store in town, and they sold mainly shoes for other manufacturers, but they also were active in making shoes or repairing shoes.
So did a lot of the residents then from Nenterhausen buy shoes from him?
Well, not only the residents from Nentershausen, but from all the other little towns in the area. He was very well known. He had many friends.
And you mentioned that your father also participated in the First World War. Did
Right.
he tell you and your siblings anything about his time during the war?
Well, he didn't talk too much about it, but he had some medals around, and we used to ask him about it. You know.
And you also mentioned that your family had been from Nenterhausen for your that side of the family had been from Nenterhausen for a really long time and that they were shoemakers. Can you tell me a little bit more about your father's side of the family?
Well, in those years, families were very numerous. The children were very numerous. As a matter of fact, my father had 5 siblings, and of course the brothers were in different occupations. But I understand that the forefathers, the other generations, always had quite a number of children, but that was, I guess, the custom at that time, not like today. No. But the oldest son always was in shoemaking related activities.
And can you tell me about your mother?
Yeah, well, my mother came from a different town than Nentershausen, but also in the immediate area. And by the time we had to leave Germany, my father was 45 years old, my mother 38, and she, of course, was dedicated to the family. You know. Besides the shoe store, my parents had several plots of land in the area, and they had a fruit garden. So they were busy with those activities.
And,
Go ahead.
and what was your mother's name?
Oh, her name was Martha, originally Hamburger, like the city of Hamburg. No. So I don't know if there was some history connected to that. We never learned about her.
And can you tell me a little bit about her side of the family?
Well, yes, her father was active buying and selling animals, I mean cows, oxes, and so on. No? And they bought it from the people who brought them up and then sold it to the slaughterhouses. No? And I don't know if the previous generations were in the same type of business. But that was her background, at least.
And do you know how your parents met?
No, never asked them.
And you mentioned that you had siblings.
Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about your siblings?
Okay. I'm one of 2 twins. No. And I had an older brother. He was older by 4 or 5 years. No. I was older to my sibling, to my twin brother by 20 minutes. And we always thought about that because I that I have special rights as the older brother. No. But you want me to go into later years, or?
Yeah, you can tell me their names and a little bit about your relationship with your brothers.
Yeah, okay. My older brother, original name was Sigbert, but here in the United States they called him Bert. No. My twin brother, his name was in German Manfred, but in later years he actually moved from Ecuador to Israel, and over there everybody called him Moishe. In Spanish, Manfredo. Manfredo. No. And unfortunately, I was the smallest in the family. No, my twin brother was about one head taller than myself. And well, that's the way it was.
And were you and your brothers close growing up?
Well, in Germany, of course, we were together. When we got to Ecuador, after about 5 years, my older brother came to the United States, and my twin brother, after at the age of 15, which means that we were together in Ecuador about 9 years, he went to Israel. No. So we were very close while we were together.
And can you tell me about your house in Nanterhausen?
Well, we lived in a relatively large house, but in the same house my grandfather was and two grandaunts lived together with us. So a total of about 8 people. No. The house was very nice, I would say, and I only have good remembrances. No. There was a fruit garden attached to it, and we had a decent life there for most of the time.
And was the house near the shoe business?
Well, the shoe business was in the same house. No, the front of the house was towards a main thoroughfare, and that's where the shoe business was. My father, my grandfather, besides shoes, they also sold bicycles in the store and sewing machines. They had some representation there.
And in the house, did you share a room with your siblings?
With my twin brother, for sure. I don't remember if we shared it with my older brother.
And if you were to step out of your house from Nanterhausen, what would you see outside of your house?
Well, we saw other houses, the neighbors' houses, and that was really it. No, probably there were stores, but I don't have a good remembrance of that. I mean, that I remember that, unfortunately. It's quite a while.
Yeah. And do you remember going to any parks in Nanterhausen or
No,
the daily life? when you were
No,
there?
what I remember is that we used to go to the fields close to Nendershausen, to the ones who belonged to my parents. No, we used to go and pick fruit. No, but there were some forests close by. We went there, but I don't remember specifically about any park.
And what was the cultural life in Nenterhausen? Do you know if there was maybe a movie theater or
Unfortunately, I don't remember that.
and do you remember any toys that you used to play with?
Well, yes, we had toys. My uncles made sure that we had plenty, and they spoiled us in certain ways. So in Germany we didn't have any problem. We, like any other boys, we entertained ourselves playing and so on.
And in addition to toys, were there any books that you remember from your time in Germany that your parents may have read to you?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. Could you repeat it?
In addition to toys, did you have any, for example, any books that you remember your parents reading to you?
Oh, yes, yes. We had plenty of books. My father used to like to read to us, and but there were the normal books which children get to know. There were, especially in that area, there were a lot of famous children writers, not children writers, but people who wrote stories for children mainly. The brothers Grimm are from that area. So
You had a favorite Brothers Grimm story?
if I did, I don't remember it any longer.
And do you remember celebrating any birthdays in Nenterhausen, yours or the ones of your siblings or your family?
No, I was 6 years old when we left Nendershausen, and it's difficult to remember things from that age.
And do you have any friends of your own in Nenterhausen, or were you mainly with your brothers?
For sure we had friends, but specifically I couldn't pinpoint any.
And do you remember, or in the years have you learned any of the people that your parents socialized with while in Nenterhausen?
Yes, I visited some of them when I had the opportunity to go back to Germany.
And their families still then remain in Nenterhausen and
Yes, yes. Especially one family which was very friendly to my parents. Others, of course, perished during the war, especially the Jewish families. Don't exist any longer, or didn't exist when I came back. What my parents had Jewish friends and also had non-Jewish friends.
And what were your parents' political views as far as you remembered or have come to learn years later?
How can I tell you? My parents were Germans, and I don't know if you know, but Germans were very strong for Germany. And even though they suffered a lot over the years, they start to forget and or even if they remember, they start to forgive. You know, what they had. They were quite strong Germans, I would say. No. And they had the opportunity, they got again German passports, no. But this is many, many years later, of course. No. Our political views, we didn't discuss. We were too small to be discussing political views or anything like that. And my parents actually liked that we forgot about the experiences, the bad experiences. And that was their point of view, that was the way they felt.
And you mentioned that your parents got their German passports again. Did they go back to Germany years later?
In Ecuador. They never became Ecuadorian citizens. No, so they were entitled to, I guess, to get back their German citizenship.
And did your family have any interest in Zionism?
Like all Jews, yes. But did we discuss that at home? No.
And do you know people who moved to Palestine during the 1930s?
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
Yeah. Do you know people that moved to Palestine in the 1930s?
Yes. As a matter of fact, our intention, my parents' intention, I have to say, was to move to Palestine, and they applied for it. My grandparents from my mother's side and her siblings, some of her siblings, went to Palestine in 1937. So my parents also wanted to go, but they even made the bank deposits and so on, and all disappeared because apparently the whatever papers they got were falsified or they paid for them, and so we never got really any permit to go to Palestine. But in those years, my parents wanted to leave Germany because of the situation. And I understand that my father applied even to Canada, to Australia, in order to find a place where they could go. And well, the fact that we went to Ecuador, that's a special story, and I'm sure you were going to ask me about it.
And I know you previously mentioned that your brother Moise moved to Israel years later. Did he meet up with your other family that had already moved there?
Well, of course, he met with them, but he became part of a kibbutz, of Latin American young people, and he joined them. So he was working in this kibbutz during his early years in Israel.
And kind of going back a little bit to Nenterhausen, What do you know about anti-Semitism in Nenterhausen during the 1930s?
Well, anything I know, I learned later. So we were children and we played with other children, and that was it. No, we were not in politics at that time.
And what were you told about it?
At that time, I don't really remember.
And later, when you were older?
Well, I learned about what happened in Kristallnacht and so on, no, which in certain way was a surprise. But it happened, and in Nendershausen actually it happened maybe before than in other towns, in other cities. But this is all what I learned from reading memoirs my brother wrote. No. So,
And
no, what I was
and
going to say is that it was nothing that I learned at the time when I was, before we left, 1938 or so. No.
and after you left, or when you were older, did you learn how Nazi laws towards Jews affected you and your family in Nenterhausen?
Of course, yes. Well, during the night of Kristallnacht, the night of broken crystals, actually the mob wanted to put fire to our home. You know, and my father, who left the house to calm down his neighbors and so on, he was beaten, and he suffered all his life from headaches because of that, and it was very bad. We were very extremely lucky that they didn't burn our house. That's because some other neighbors interceded, and they went into the store and they ransacked completely the store, and stole all the shoes who were there, and all the equipment, and we were lucky that my father was in very good terms with the mayor of the city, and he helped us to recover in the next days part of what was stolen. Not only the merchandise store, but they went into the living quarters and they took my mother's porcelain and glass and all kinds of furnishings and so on, destroyed the furniture, but we survived, and that's the important part. Yeah.
And as a child, how did you feel when all of this was happening?
I cannot tell you because I don't have any remembrances really. Nothing stayed with me so that I would say I hate people and so on. No. We were children and we didn't understand it probably at that time.
And you mentioned that people entered your house and into the living quarters. Did they only take the porcelain? Did they destroy anything from
yes.
inside of the house?
They destroyed furniture, as I mentioned, and they stole the bedding and whatever they could put their hand on. At the time we were hiding in the attic of the house, and fortunately they bypassed us, I could say. My father, according to my brother, my father took me and my twin brother with him when he went to pacify the people who were wanting to get into the house. I don't have any recall of it.
And before Kristallnacht, do you know if your father's business had already been impacted? For example, were people not buying from him, or?
From what I read, that was the case. Because he even, not clear to me if he got the letter before or after Kristallnacht indicating that he did not belong any longer to the Shoemaker Association, that because he was a Jew, they had to disqualify him. So as a matter of fact, after Kristallnacht, couple of days later, he was incarcerated and sent to one of the concentration camps. And when he was let go, it was on the condition that he and his family would leave Germany.
Was your father the only person in your family that was targeted during this period, or?
Not quite. My grandfather was. He was also put in concentration camp, and two of my uncles were, and they also were let go after about a month or so. But in the case of my father, he specifically was told that because he had participated, they let him go because he had participated in the First World War as a soldier. And they let him, because of that, he was let go earlier, and about 1 month after he was in concentration camp, but he was told that the best thing he could do is leave Germany.
Do you know the name of the concentration camp?
Yes, it was Buchenwald.
And was he arrested the same day that your house was attacked, or did you go somewhere after the attack?
I'm sorry. After the attack the next day, he actually got in contact with a cousin of him who had a car and asked him to take us to Frankfurt, which was a big city close to Nendershausen. And because he had cousins there, and so he thought that by going to the big city, we would be safer there. And but I understand that when we got to Frankfurt, actually, he saw synagogues burning there and so on. But the next day, he decided to go back to see what the situation was in Nendershausen. And that's when he was arrested in the train he had taken to go back to Nendershausen. They recognized him and they arrested him.
And when your family went to Frankfurt, do you know what you all took with you? What belongings you took with you?
No. Well, no idea.
And what happened to your father's cousin who took you to Frankfurt that had the car?
Actually, he had been on a list of people that were going to annihilate, because he was in the government, and apparently they didn't like that Jews be in the government. So he may have saved his life by taking us to Frankfurt. The distance from Nendershausen to Frankfurt, I understand it's about like 80 miles. You know.
And while you were in Frankfurt, do you know where you were staying? Were you staying with Norbert or?
Oh, no, we were staying with relatives for my father. Right.
And were you all then staying together?
Yes, yes.
And for how long were you in Frankfurt for?
Oh, I do not know how long we stayed there. No. I guess that was a decision my mother had to make at that point, since my father had been put in the concentration camp. But I don't know how long we were in Frankfurt.
And you mentioned that your father was in Buchenwald for a month. When he escaped, when he left the camp, is that when your family then decided to leave Germany?
Well, he was told that best thing for him would be to leave Germany. So at that time they had to scramble and see where they could go. No. But we, as I mentioned before, we wanted to go to Palestine at that time, but we didn't get any response from the English government, which was in charge at that time of Palestine. And he tried to go to other countries with negative results. But we were fortunate in that how do you say it? Well, one of my father's brothers was married, or had been married to a lady which brother had gone to Ecuador. He went to Ecuador in 1935. I understand that he was a part of a mission, intellectual mission. He was a teacher of music and of singing, and he was an opera singer actually. And he, in Ecuador, started teaching in many high schools, not only he went to teach also in Catholic high schools, you know, and he was very friendly with the Archbishop of Quito. And when the time came for the family to emigrate, he got visas for the entire family. You know, first for his brother-in-law and his wife, then for his parents, then for the brothers of his brother-in-law, so that in 1939, 3 of my uncles emigrated to Ecuador, and he got visas for our family. So the Catholic Church actually sponsored our emigration from Germany to Ecuador. And because my parents had owned these plots of land around Nentershausen, they could call themselves agriculturists, you know, that they understood how to grow plants and so on. You know, after all, they had these plots of land where different plants were growing. I mean, no, I don't remember the names right now. But anyway, they had 3 or 4 plots of land, and that was their explanation as to why they had knowledge in agricultural work. And so to get the visas was not too difficult for them. And that's how we went to Ecuador, because didn't have any other place to go, really. But I don't believe that my parents even know at that time where Ecuador was located. You know, and this happened to many of the immigrants to Ecuador. Even today, if you talk to somebody in Europe about Ecuador, they know there's some good soccer players there, but otherwise they wouldn't know about Ecuador. It's too small.
And do you know how was it that your family in Germany was put in communication with your family members that were now in Ecuador before they left? How did that happen?
Well, naturally, the family was very close, and my parents knew that, or at least my father, that his brothers had emigrated to Ecuador, and yes, at that time, I already had mail or airmail. No, so it wasn't difficult. No, the communication was not the problem.
And once they got the visas to go to Ecuador, was the goal staying in Ecuador, or do you know if they were thinking of, okay, we'll stay here for a little bit and then from there go somewhere else?
No, they were happy to know that there was a place where they could go. No, so no, they never thought that, at least not at that time, that they may go somewhere else.
And as a child, do you remember how you felt about learning that you were going to go to Ecuador?
No, it didn't make any difference to me, even if I was told that we were going to a faraway land. No.
And do you remember seeing or do you remember anything about the process of moving to Ecuador, of the packing or deciding what to take or not to take?
Not personally.
And when you went to Ecuador, can you tell me a little bit about, so you're in Frankfurt, where do you go after Frankfurt?
Well, that's a long story, as a matter of fact. No. Well, first I have to tell you that we were extremely lucky, because even though my parents got the visa to Ecuador, now the question was, and they got the visas to Ecuador in the middle of 1940. No. Now, how to get there, that was a different story. No. You could have visas, but how do you get there? No, so my father, of course, they start making all kind of arrangements to get passports and to get visas and so on. But it's a matter of luck, really, the fact that we were able to go to Ecuador when we went, because it so happened that one of my great uncles was offered a passage, a ticket to go to Ecuador, for which at that time, this was in September of 1940, but at that time Germany already had taken over Holland, Belgium, France, so there was no way of getting out towards the west. But Germany had not started their war with I'm sorry, had not started the war with Russia yet. We have a problem here.
Let's just
You
pause.
have that-
We'll just pause the camera right now,
Yes,
okay?
please.
So we're back from a break, and we were discussing your family's journey from Frankfurt to Ecuador, and you were just telling me about the reason why you could not go to Ecuador through the west, and you had to go through the east.
Correct. So we were lucky in that my great uncle, the brother of my grandfather, got actually a ticket or a promise of a ticket to go via Russia and Japan to South America. And he decided that the younger people in the family should go before him. And the two younger people practically were my father and my aunt. When my aunt told her husband that he should go, he said, we both go or none of us go. So then they said, okay, Willie, my father, should go. And he decided to accept, in spite of the fact that he would leave the rest of his family in Germany. But they applied to the same organization, which was the Hilfsverein for Jews, which means the aid society for Jews, that was sponsoring the trip, the paying for the tickets and so on, that they should also get tickets for the rest of the family, for mother and for the kids, and fortunately they did so. So just about less than 1 week before we left from Nendershausen, where my parents advised that they all could go. And at that time, my father had to concentrate in getting all the visas for the different countries, because from Germany we had to go to Russia, and from Russia to China, and from China to Korea, and to Japan, and so on. And he spent a lot of time doing that while they were preparing whatever they were going to take with them, my parents. And there was a situation where they were limiting whatever the people who were living in Germany could take with them. But we were lucky. They prepared the list, and the list was approved of things they wanted to take with them. And so they had crates prepared for things which they intended to take, and in addition to the crates, hand luggage. I mentioned this because it, during the story, will reappear. No. But the Aid Society said to them, you have to live, this was the middle of September, or the end of September, only 1 week left. You have to leave October 1st, in order to be on time in Japan to take the boat. So everything had to be concluded between a few days, that October 1st later became October 2nd, but it was very limited time. So on October 2nd, my parents with my siblings went from Nendershausen to Berlin. They departed at 4 o'clock in the morning from Nendershausen. Because of a delay in Leipzig, they got there at 7 o'clock. I mentioned this because of what happened in Berlin to us. As we got to the railroad station and were going to take the underground, my older brother got on the subway and the doors closed. My parents were still on the platform with us, with twins. Fortunately, my brother had the intuition to get off the subway at the next station. We took the next subway, and fortunately, he was waiting there, because I can imagine what would have happened if we had to look for my brother after that. No. Okay, we reunited, and we went to the house of some cousins my father had in Berlin. We didn't have the tickets yet. So next day, and this was the day before the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, which is a major holiday. So on Rosh Hashanah, my father went to the Aid Society for the tickets, and they told him he had to come back 2 days later. The tickets were not available yet. Well, that became a few days. So we were going to go from Berlin to the city of Königsberg, which today is Kaliningrad in Russia. It became, I believe, October 6 or 7 before we were able to go on the train from Berlin to Kaliningrad. But our luck was that evening the Royal Air Force, English Air Force, decided to attack the train line in which we were going. But somehow we escaped, and we were the next morning at our destination. But the train was late, and they had arranged for a plane to fly to take us from Königsberg to Moscow. But there were some agents from the Aid Society who actually asked the plane to wait for us. Apparently, there must have been more people on the train besides ourselves who also had to go the same way as we went. We were emigrating from Germany. So the plane waited for half an hour by the time we arrived there. And then we flew from Königsberg to Moscow. And I don't know if there were stops in between, but that evening we arrived to Moscow. And there was some agent from Intourist, which is a Russian company who takes care of the travelers there, and they took us to Hotel Metropole. I mention it because years later I was in Moscow, and I went to the hotel, which we had stayed 2 days there in Moscow. No, go ahead.
How was that experience of going back to the hotel years later?
Yeah, well, in 1978, I was sent by the company. They had a contract, actually, to install machine to make cables, underground cables. And I am a specialist in that. So I was selected as the engineer who would go there, and that's why I was in Russia. And I had the opportunity at that time to go back. It was quite an experience. I don't know, I don't think that too much had changed in the hotel from 1940 to 1978, but it was quite an experience. But that's another story.
And can you tell me a little bit about, as a child, if anything stood up to you in your journey to Moscow? How first just the train itself, but then also just the plane too?
Well, I don't remember anything from that particular train, but I do remember that in the plane, myself and my siblings were vomiting a lot. No, well, those planes didn't, first of all, they had limited number of passengers. No, I think that particular one had carried 17 passengers, and they flew at relatively low altitude, and you could feel any time they hit the air pocket, and it wasn't too good of an experience. We were very happy to get to Moscow.
And when you're in Moscow and you're in the Hotel Metropole, did anything stand out to you from the hotel?
Well, I think I have some remembrances. I remember seeing that a big building was moved from where it was farther into the street, into the side of the street, I would say. And I also do remember the short way we took. Again, it's difficult to say what is my memory from that time or from when I went later. I was in Moscow in 1978 for 3 months, so I think that most of what I remember is from this last trip, not from the earlier trip. Well, I don't know what else to tell you.
And from Moscow, where did you go afterward?
We had to take the Trans-Siberian Express, which was a train who went from one end of Russia practically to the other end. The end station was in Vladivostok. And we were on this train for 7 days consecutively, day and night. And we had one compartment for the family, and we slept there, we ate. I think there was no, I don't remember that very well. No, if we ate in the same compartment or if there was a different compartment, but what I do remember is that we stayed on the same train, that at some places they had to change or close the window shades because we're not supposed to see whatever's going on in the fields there. But that was closer to the end of the trip than at the beginning. No. But it was quite an experience. During my stay in Russia, I was discussing it with some people there, with some colleagues and Russian colleagues. Who said that today it still takes 7 days to go from Moscow to Vladivostok, just like in those times. No. Not too much has changed.
And do you remember celebrating any major holidays while you were in the Trans-Siberian train?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I told you we started our trip the day before Rosh Hashanah. No, and 8 days later, we have the celebration of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and we were actually in the train while that celebration was taking place. You know. Then there were some other holidays, but those were the later part of the trip, but also during the trip itself. You know, from Vladivostok, we went to Harbin in China, and there we celebrated Sukkot, which is another holiday. And from Harbin, we went down through North Korea and South Korea to Busan in South Korea, and from there we took a boat to Japan. And there was a Jewish community center in Kobe in Japan. We also stopped there. As a matter of fact, we stayed there for one day. And then we continued by train to Yokohama, which is port next to Tokyo. And that's when we embarked in the boat called Kinyomaru, which was a boat which took merchandise to different countries in the Americas and so on. But they, because of the number of refugees who were leaving from Germany, maybe some other countries too, which came in the same direction, they had actually converted some of their cargo compartment into a place where the immigrants could sleep and so on. And that's what we had to use too, you know. And as I remember that it was very hot in those compartments, if I call it compartments, but were cargo compartments actually, and we spent a lot of time on the decks of the boat, you know. And then from Yokohama, the boat went to Honolulu in the Hawaii Islands, then to other islands where they delivered merchandise, whatever the boat had to do, and then we continued from Hawaii to San Francisco, and that I still remember vividly, because I didn't have a concept of perspective, and I thought that the main mast of the boat was going to hit the Golden Gate Bridge. And from the distance, it's pointing to the center practically and going to hit the bridge. And we were with my brother, and for sure we were yelling for our parents because we thought that was going to be the end of us. You know, but then we passed underneath it, of course. And from San Francisco, we went to Los Angeles and then to El Salvador. And finally, we got to Balboa in Panama, where we left the boat. So we had spent 5 weeks on the Kinyomaru. In Panama, from Balboa, we later went to Colón, to the other side of the isthmus, and in Colón we stayed for 2 weeks. because we had needed the final permit to go into Ecuador, and also because we were waiting for a boat to take us. No. So from Panama, finally, we went with one of the boats from the Grace Float. I don't know if you have heard about them, but they are a combination of passengers and cargo. And then we went from Panama to Buenaventura, and from there to Guayaquil in Ecuador. No. In Guayaquil, I believe we stayed one night, and then next day, by train, we went to Quito, the capital of Ecuador, and that was another day's trip. Yeah.
And kind of going back a little bit to your time in the boat, how was that experience of being for such a long time in a boat with your family as a child?
It was an experience, but nothing out of this world. Unfortunately, my parents were very religious, and Jewish religious people eat kosher. I don't know if you know too much about that. No, and so, but my mother managed to keep the kosher and keep the tradition. She bought even pots to cook during the trip, and she convinced the Japanese, even though she didn't speak the language, no, she made her understood that she wanted to cook for her family, and they allowed her to do that. No, so we were very close together, of course. We depended on our parents at that time. Whatever they said, we had to do, no? As obedient children. And so, yes.
And did you befriend any other children while in the boat?
I don't have any recollection. There may have been, but I don't recall.
And in addition of the time when you thought that your boat was gonna hit the Golden Bridge, is there any other moment from your time in the boat that stayed with you, that stood out with you?
Well, one incident in Hawaii, where some ladies from a Jewish aid society came on board and gave us candy and delivered stuff to my parents. You know, that's the only other incident that I remember.
And you said that you and your family stayed in Colón for 2 weeks. Were you staying with Jewish Association, or where were you staying while in Colón?
I understood that we were staying at like a colony where a Jewish colony of some kind, but I don't know any details of that. You know. But what for us, wherever we could stay, you know, it was some Jewish aid society who sponsored that.
And once you got to Ecuador, what were your first impressions of the country as a child?
Well, as a matter of fact, we arrived to Ecuador on December 24. You know, So on the boat we got some toys, which we cherished actually because we didn't have anything else. Children, of course, toys are very important. What other impression? No, we were in a different country, different people, not what one was accustomed in Europe. No, start seeing people who walk around without shoes. It hits you, no? And you ask why and so on. You saw that the level of education was different. Of course, as a child, 6 years old, it doesn't make the same impression as if you got hit by that as an adult. But we saw differences, and I remember that when the train which we took to go from Guayaquil to Quito, my father got off the train to buy some bananas. And he was so impressed by the low price, he couldn't stop talking about it, that he only paid whatever he paid. No. In Europe it was very expensive to buy bananas. No, because we as children, we were very happy because bananas is a delicious fruit. No. And so besides that, all the impressions were obtained later, not during the moment we got to Ecuador. No.
And you mentioned the toys that you got on December 24th.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
One of them was one of those trick-trackers. I don't know what they call it. No, it made noise, and we were jumping around with it. No. Some other were balloons, no, marbles, simple things. No.
And when you were in Quito, did you remain in Quito or did you go somewhere else afterward?
The condition on my parents' visas was that since they indicated that they knew about agriculture, they have to go and work in the field. So my uncles who had arrived practically a year earlier, they already had rented a small farm, what they call a quinta there, no, and had some farmland there. No, so after some time, let's say a couple of weeks in Quito, we also rented another quinta, another small farmland, which, by the way, today is part of the city of Quito. No, by the time we got there, Quito had let's say close to 300,000 inhabitants. Today it's a city of 3 million people. No, so it has grown significantly. And we went to this little farm where we stayed, but that wasn't good times, I would say, because that farmland, there was no running water, there was no calefacción. Quito, I have to say, is located close to 10,000 feet in elevation, so it's rather cold, especially during the nights, and there was no calefacción at all. And the, it must have been a tremendous shock, especially for my parents. We are children, of course, didn't feel it that bad, but were very hard times. And then they really couldn't make a living out of that at all, out of farming. So we probably were on the farm for a year and a half, then moved back to the city.
And while you were there, did you and your brothers meet anyone else? Did you have any friendships with other children before you moved back to Quito?
Maybe some friendship we had with the children, which were with the kids from the owners of the place, which used to come sometimes to visit, but that was all. No, but when we start going to school, because we were 6 years old, and so on, they arranged for a teacher. By the way, one of my uncles had another little farm, or had rented the place about a mile away or so. And he started baking bread there. And that's where they installed a school for children, for the Indian children. And we went to the same school because there was no other schooling. So it wasn't the most pleasant place to be. I don't know how to explain it, but very rudimentary. There were some blanks of wood made into sitting places, everything very, very rustic. But that's the way we survived, anyway.
And were there a lot of children in the school?
No, you can count them with your two hands.
And in thinking about your experience in school here in Ecuador, had you gone to school in Nanterhausen?
No.
Or your older?
Because of our age, and besides that, they were not accepting any Jewish kids in public schools. My older brother went to a private school in Frankfurt. Besides, we were just getting to the age of going to school. So we never went to school in Germany.
And do you know how, if your older brother Bert ever expressed a difference between how it was going to school in Germany in comparison to Ecuador?
Well, quite different. No, you cannot compare it. No, not even when we went to the city. No, went to a public school, but there's no comparison with Germany at that time. No. Not to say that you couldn't learn in Ecuador, no, but the conditions were different.
And do you remember anything from your day-to-day life before your family went back to Quito, about how was it as a child and as your parents were doing agriculture too? And
yeah, well, it was very rudimentary. I mean, there was nothing to really to brag about or anything like that. It wasn't like you live in the field, you have to do whatever you can do there. And we didn't have friends, as you asked me before. No, there were no friends to be had around there. Besides that, we were just learning the language. No, there was another experience, of course. No, we spoke German between us. No, but then in school you had to learn to speak even to the Indian boys, no, in Spanish, and so that had to be learned.
And you mentioned that an uncle lived near
Yes.
you. Was there a lot of was there a big Jewish community around that area,
No.
or was it mainly both of your families?
That was just our families. No Jewish people used to live in the same area that I know.
And how was the transition from going from there back to Quito?
Okay, what I do remember is that the first big visit was during the Jewish holidays, and we went to the synagogue in Quito. At least there were two synagogues, and we went to one of them. And that's where we got to know other Jewish people. They were, of course, very nice. And my father finished renting space in the same building where the synagogue was for the family, and he started going from house to house, especially between the immigrants, to ask for shoes to be repaired and so on. No. They're very difficult times, no, but we survived.
And do you remember the house where you lived while in Quito?
I'm sorry? Could you repeat?
Do you remember the place where you lived while in Quito?
Oh, yes, I remember it very well because in the same place, as I told you, was synagogue. And then later they started a Jewish school, which I started to attend. And there were again just very few students in that school. It was called Liceo Quito. And I guess first and second year I was there. On the third year I went to a public school because they closed that school. They didn't have enough students.
So while in Liceo Quito, were then a lot of your classmates and friends, were they then also from the Jewish community then, that were refugees, or?
Not at all. Only in religious classes would it be with Jewish. We went to a public school. There was not one Jewish child in there, no. My parents didn't have money, so we had to go to whatever we could afford, let's say. No, a lot of Jewish students, they went to private schools or whatever they could afford to, no. But in the particular school, public school we went, we were the only Jewish students. No. My older brother, I think he already started going to high school when we went to public school, and that was a big school, but and I later went to the same high school as my older brother.
And how was that experience of you and your twin being in school in Ecuador, well, in Quito?
Well, we had to learn to live with it, no? We made friends. There were some nice kids, no, which we, for many, many years, we were friends with them after school, when high school, or even after that, no. So, but there were just a few of them. No. But we we had to learn to live with whatever we had. That's it. Yeah.
And how was the experience learning Spanish?
Again, as a child, you learn easily. You just repeat, and it's not forced on you. It's not. It was simple. Repetition. At that time, we didn't have a radio. We didn't have a television. Didn't exist yet. So you just have to. You have to learn. That's it. No. How fast you learned, I don't know, but.
And your parents had the same experience learning Spanish, or was it a bit different for them?
It was different. They really never learned to speak Spanish perfectly. No, they had to work and learn. No. So it was nothing easy. No. Especially as a shoemaker, you in a country where there are thousands of shoemakers, because it's not such a difficult profession. No, well, my father specialized in orthopedic shoes, but it wasn't any easy. My mother had to also, she started working, she started making noodles to sell, and some baked stuff, or your marmalade she made, and she made sauerkraut, and she made pickles, and wherever she could put her hands on them, other people were interested to buy. Especially she made it to the European style, so the immigrants, of course, were very anxious to buy things like that. So she did very well over the years. But she always worried.
So did you and your siblings had to then help your parents with their Spanish then on their day-to-day basis?
Yeah, well, especially my older brother, and but yes, we had to help. We had to go to the stores for them. We had to do errands all the time. But that was part of life. That's the way we grew up.
Yeah, and you mentioned that your mom would sell mainly to the European community in Quito. Was this the same as for your father with his shoe business?
Yes, he had. Well, he had bought later. He had bought European and Ecuadorian customers. But at the beginning, it was mainly with the Europeans, because they could, especially with the Germans, because they could communicate relatively easily. And for nobody who just came to the country, it was easy.
And can you tell me about the house where you and your family lived while in Quito?
Well, in Quito first, I told you we were in the same house as the Jewish community, or the synagogue. And actually, after we had to move out, I don't know if we had to move out, or in any case, we moved. We followed again the synagogue, went to a bigger building, and we rented space in the lower floor of this building. It was a 4-story building, I believe, 3 or 4 story building. We were in the first floor, and the second floor was the synagogue and community rooms and school, or Jewish school, religious school, let's call it. And then there was a Jewish restaurant also on the second floor. And third floor, another Jewish family lived. No. Then, well, then we moved to another house. But there were a few years in between each time.
And how was it living in that first floor?
It was okay, We went to school. We had to help our parents a little, but no complaints. No, nothing special.
And what were your favorite places to visit while you were in Quito? So where will you be going when you were out and about?
Well, it depends on at what age I was, But favorite places, I guess there we could go to parks, we could go to play with our friends and so on. No, but it was decent. No, we didn't have too much luxuries, if at all. But we survived. That's the important thing.
And when you were older, did you go to any specific places with your friends?
I would go to the movies. And sometimes we used to stand in the corner and just talk. But it's difficult to pinpoint. Because it depends on the age one is in. At some point you get to go to parties more frequently and so on. But it was okay.
And can you tell me a little bit about the culture in Ecuador and growing up around it?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, first we went to grammar school, and at some point we finished that, and then I went to college, to high school. In Ecuador you call it colegio, that's why I get confused with college. And high school, and we had good friends, and studied together, and as young people do, And my brothers, as I mentioned before, I think one left to come to the United States, and that was that was when I was about 11 years old or so, and the other one left when we were about 15 years old. He didn't like to school too much, so, well, it was circumstance. So he started working with one of my uncles in their bakery, and then he decided that he would like to go to Israel, and because we had family already there, my parents were in agreement, and he became very successful in Israel and later in Germany. While I continued in Quito, and I went to high school, and then I went to the Polytechnic school and study electrical engineering, and here I am.
Yeah. And thinking about your life in Ecuador, did you grow up listening to a lot of Ecuadorian music or eating also the food? How do you still enjoy it today?
No, well, do I enjoy Ecuadorian food? I got accustomed to the German food, which my mother used to cook, and yes, I like some Ecuadorian food, but I'm not one of the individuals who, when we were, I have to explain here that my parents, I already said, were quite religious, and so for them it was very important that we, the kids, also followed whatever they were accustomed to. So I didn't really eat Ecuadorian food until years later, and then not everything either. But there's very good Ecuadorian food too. No. Um, that's as much as I can tell you. Some dishes I like, and that's it.
And while you were in Ecuador, did you date outside of the Jewish community, or was it only within the community, or not at all?
Well, with the community mainly. I did have Ecuadorian friends, and I attended their parties and so on, but mainly was the Jewish community.
And you mentioned that Bert left when you were 11 years old. How was that experience of your older brother living for the United States?
Well, actually, he came here to be educated in a yeshiva. And well, he later realized that he didn't really like that style of life, and he separated himself. So, well, we were missing him, that's all, But we learned to live with that. Not too many complaints. You don't want to make your parents feel bad, so but he always was a good brother.
And while in Ecuador, did you and your family experience any racism, anti-Semitism, or xenophobia?
No. We didn't even know about those things. No. We were just part of our group, and nobody ever said anything to us. No, called us something. Or, no. Felt very well there. And up to today I have friends there, so everything went well.
And you mentioned that your brother Moise, he went to Israel, and you stay in Ecuador, and when you graduated high school, you studied to become an engineer. How did you decide to become an engineer?
That's a good question. Well, how did I decide to become? I used to walk all the time from school to my house. I used to think, well, what am I going to be? What am I going to be? Then I started to analyze what I'd like more. I thought that in the last year of high school, we had to make a decision if we were going to be in the engineering. There were three different possibilities: social studies, biological studies, or mathematical studies. So I said I'm best off. I didn't like to see blood or things like that, so that was out of for me. The social studies, you have to be a good speaker, you have to be outgoing. So again, I decided that's not for me. So I was left with mathematical studies. So I decided to become an engineer. That's as simple as it was to make a decision. Analyzing the different possibilities.
And did you enjoy your studies while in the university?
Well, yes, I enjoyed them, and I think I became a good professional at the end, and it was rewarding. No. When I was what I was going to tell you is that while I was in Ecuador studying in the Polytechnic School, I got the opportunity of a scholarship to Germany, actually. I guess one of the reasons was that I spoke good German at the time. And I used the opportunity. I went for 1 year to study at a technical university in Germany. And after 1 year, I went back to Ecuador, completed my studies there, and became an electrical engineer.
And was that visit to Germany for your studies, was that the first visit you going back since you had left when you were younger?
Yes, that was the first opportunity, and I couldn't believe myself that I was back in Germany. I had to pinch myself. No, is it really real? Because in Ecuador, it's a dream that one could go to Europe to study or to do anything. No, but everything worked out.
And in what year was this?
This was in 1958. And it's interesting. One coincidence happened to me while I was in Germany. One day I was with some friends, German friends, and he's asking me, one of my German friends, why which I had been, I got to know him through somebody from Colombia who also was studying in the university in Germany. And he's telling me, he said, what are you going to do during this coming back vacation, just a few days vacation? So I said to him, I'm going to go to my place of origin, where I was born. And he said, and where is it? I looked at him, I said, I'm not going to tell you because the word is too big and too difficult. You probably would not remember it anyway if I tell you. He says, no, tell me. So I tell him, I'm going to Nendershausen. He says, to Nendershausen? I said, yes. And he tells me, well, my grandfather used to be the mayor of the town. No. So surprised, I wrote to my parents and they remembered his grandfather. No, in the same school, there was a big coincidence. No. After that, we got to be better friends. No.
And is his grandfather the mayor then during Kristallnacht help your family
But somebody before that. No. So he wasn't the one at the time of Kristallnacht. No.
And when you were in Germany, where were you primarily?
In the city, studying is what you're asking me? Yes, in Darmstadt. Excuse me. That's also in the same state where I was born, in Hessen. And but it's south of Frankfurt. Has a big technical university.
And after being in Germany, you then came back to Quito, you said, to finish your studies.
Right. I had 1 year more to go. And then in Ecuador, one has to prepare a thesis. It's not like in the United States where bachelor is 4 years of study. In Ecuador, actually, it's 5 years, and the thesis has to be prepared And you have to defend your thesis after you deliver it. And so that's what I did. So it took me 2 years or so to finish, or 2.5 years. No, after which I obtained the title of electrical engineer. And then is when I decided, I decided to come to the States, because in Ecuador there were not too many opportunities. No, there were opportunities, but it was different than in the States.
I'm curious, what was your thesis about?
Oh, it was about refurbishing a power station in a town close by to Quito. And when I presented the subject, they said, fine. No, and I actually, I had dedicate my life, my time to preparing it.
And when was it then? So you decided to go to the United States. When was this?
Well, I guess over the years I already had decided, because of the lack of opportunities in Ecuador, and my brother was here. He had become an electrical engineer too, and so I had discussed it with him, and then I decided I will come to the States for a trial, just to see how it is living in the States. After I did come actually, and then after a few months I decided to emigrate to the States. It wasn't that complicated like it's today, especially since I already had a brother here in the States. No. During that trial period, I took with me, I went to the public library, I looked into magazines, into books, what companies I would be interested in, and then I went back to Ecuador. I wrote about 200 companies, sent letters saying that coming to the States and would they be interested in an electrical engineer with this and this background and so on. And about 5 companies answered me positively. So I came here for interviews. I went to a few interviews, and one of the companies told me, come to work for us. No.
And in what state was the company?
Oh, actually the headquarters were in New York, but their facilities were all over the States. There are many factories, and the research laboratories were here in New Jersey. And I was fortunate that they sent me to work to their research laboratories, because much more wider fields, and don't get stuck in a corner. It worked for me.
And in what year was this?
Oh, I came here in 1962.
And
I
now that
what I was going to say is that they sent me to the research laboratory in the town of Bayonne here in New Jersey.
And now that you were in New Jersey, were you in closer contact also with your brother Bert?
Oh yes, for the first 2 weeks, I think he got me a bed to sleep in, and then I rented a room close to him. Stayed there for 3 or 4 months, I think 3 months, and then I moved to Bayonne, where I was working at that time. So Bayonne is just um, across the bay here. Bayonne is in New Jersey and very close to Manhattan. So it was very convenient.
And what were your first impressions of the United States when you moved here?
Well, good impressions. I had to learn to live here by myself. My parents were not there any longer to feed me or help me. No, neither my uncles or anybody. In Ecuador, I have to mention we were a very close family, very united. And so I had to learn to live by myself. That's the greatest shock, I guess.
And did you make any friends when you moved here by yourself? Were they mainly from the company or?
Yeah, well, I made friends with other engineers in the company, and also had some which had moved from Ecuador, to here. As a matter of fact, somebody who was a good friend with my older brother in Ecuador became a good friend to me here. And we would go together to places or to pass the time. But as a young engineer, what are you going to do? Try to make some friends.
And did you meet your wife while in the United States?
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, I came here, I arrived in February, and it was December when I met her, and with this friend which I just mentioned a moment ago, we went to a party of another friend, and there's where I met her. And we had some common interests. I used to like Philadelphia stamp collecting, and she also liked stamp collecting. And so we found some mutual likeness, things which we both liked, and that's how we became well friends. And we got married by August of the next year. And we're married for 60 years. She passed away early this year.
And what was her name?
Sandy, Sandra, actually. I would call her Sandy.
And was Sandra from the United States?
Oh, yes. They actually lived in Long Island, and her father was a pharmacist, and it was a nice family. The parents of her parents were Europeans too, but she was 100% American, from Brooklyn.
And what did she do for a living?
Oh, she was a teacher. She teach especially children with disabilities. Was grammar school teacher. But she worked for a couple of years, and after that she had to dedicate to bringing up our children.
How many children did you have?
Oh, two. David and Joseph, or Joseph and David. No.
And are they still in New Jersey, or have they moved abroad?
No, my older son, Joseph, he lives here in New Jersey, and about 3/4 of an hour from here, and he has 3 children. The younger one, David, he lives in Florida. He's an attorney. Oh, my Joseph is a nurse. Actually, he works in the local hospital. But David's an attorney. He works in Florida. His wife is also an attorney. And his oldest son is an attorney. And another one is in school to be an attorney. Oh, but he has 4 children.
And have you been back to Ecuador by yourself or with your family since you left in 1962?
Yes, a number of times. No. My wife, of course, it was an experience for her the first time she went. No. But Ecuador has changed a lot. No. Quito is a very modern city now. And we have been there quite a number of times, especially when my parents were still living there, because they also moved to Israel. They actually passed away in Israel at a mature age. And but I still have uncles, and at this point I still have a cousin with his family who lives in Quito. No. So yes, we have been back.
And when did your parents leave Ecuador?
Oh, you're asking me what year? My father was in the early 70s, early to mid 70s. They moved to Israel, and the reason they moved there was that my maternal grandmother was still alive in Israel, and my mother wanted to spend her last few years with her mother. So that's why, and I have uncles there too, brothers of my mother. And so that was the main reason they moved from Ecuador to Israel.
And were they also there with Moise?
Not Moishe, not Moises. Manfred. No, yes, but that's another story, because my brother, the year when I decided to come to the States, my brother decided to come from Israel also to the States. But at that time, he stopped in Hamburg in Germany, and the Israeli offered him a job, which he accepted, and the job was to sell merchandise to sailors aboard their merchant boats. No, but when this individual learned that my brother had a restaurant in Israel, he said to him, I also have a restaurant here in Hamburg. Maybe you like to manage it. Because I don't have a manager there. So my brother accepted that. And between 1 year, he opened his own restaurant. And at one point, he had like 20 to 30 restaurants in Germany. He went back to Israel and opened restaurants in Israel. So he had restaurants in Germany and in Israel. No. He was very successful. No, extremely successful. As a matter of fact, after a few years in Germany, I would say, after 6, 7 years in Germany, he sent me tickets to come with my whole family to visit him in Germany. You know, he knew how to open restaurants and make them successful. Unfortunately, he passed away about 18 years ago. No. My older brother also passed away 6 weeks ago. So, c'est la vie.
And you mentioned that you went back to Nenterhausen. How was that experience of going back? Did you go? I know you went there when you were doing that year of study, but did you go there with your siblings too, with Bert and Manfred?
Yes. No, well, the first time I went back was when I was studying in Germany. At that time, still some of the old neighbors were alive, and my father sent me a list as to whom should I pass greetings and so on. But the next time we went, I think I went on 2 occasions, but the next major time was in 1999. We had been in Germany. Also, my older brother with his wife were in Germany, and myself with my wife were to the bar mitzvah to one of my brother's children. He was married twice. He first got married while he was in this Latin American kibbutz, and second time, I don't remember exactly the date, but he got divorced from his first wife and he married again, and he had 3 children with the second wife. And it was the bar mitzvah of the second one, so we were all together in Germany and decided on that occasion to go to Nentershausen. I needed a copy of my certificate of birth at the time for some reason. Yeah, somebody asked me, and so we went, and but we had a very interesting experience. As a matter of fact, 2 experiences. But the first day we were back in the town, my older brother said, let's go and visit the cemetery, our forefathers, which we all agreed. And we were in the car with my brother, and we rolled along the road. We would know that the cemetery was, but we couldn't find the cemetery. So we decided to ask. And the reason we couldn't find it is because they had planted trees around the cemetery. So we couldn't see it from the road perfect. And there we see a lady coming towards the car and with a child. My brother stops his car and close to the lady and say, lady, could you please help us? And this lady looks at the car, say, yes, what can I do? But before you tell me what I can do, would you get out of your car? That was a strange request. So anyway, all 3 brothers got out of the car. And the next thing this lady says, who of you is Bert? No, and of course, not Bert, she asked, who is Siegbert? Who of you 3 is Siegbert? And of course, my brother Bert answered, it's me. He said, why do you ask me? From where do you know my name? He says, don't you remember me? We used to play when you were small. No, and she identified herself. She was the daughter of a lady who used to help my mother in the kitchen, especially for the holidays. And he said, don't you remember that your mother left all her pots when she left for South America? No, to my mother. Of course, Bert didn't remember, but after she told her details, he started to remember about her. But it was very interesting. No. The other experience during that trip is that we went to a town hall. I asked the clerk, I said, I'm here to get a copy of my birth certificate. He said, what's your name? I said, Katz. No. Are you one of the twins? they knew about that. There was a Katz twins. No, so you asked me about my experiences while visiting Nendershausen. No.
And when you went to Mentorshausen, what had happened to the synagogue since Kristallnacht?
That's also very interesting. Excuse me one moment. Can we interrupt just one moment, please?
Yes.
So we're back from a break, and we were talking about your visit to Nentershausen and the changes that happened with the synagogue after Kristallnacht.
Oh. Well, the synagogue in Nendershausen actually was, let me tell you what happened. They wanted to burn the synagogue. They took all the sacred books, the prayer books, out of the synagogue and they burned them. They wanted to put fire to the building during Kristallnacht, but they desisted of doing that because the synagogue was attached to another building and that would have burned too. So they decided to collapse the building. And the building had one central, like a pole in the center of the synagogue. And they climbed this pole to cut it from the top. And they had to desist of it because the saw broke. And we later, when we visited the synagogue, the rebuilt synagogue, they still had that as a commemorative device there. Inserted in the pole was this broken saw. It so happened that after Kristallnacht, because the synagogue had been desecrated, it wasn't anymore useful as such, and they sold it to one of the neighbors, which then converted it in the following years into a garage, into a warehouse. It became completely dilapidated over the years. And the individual who was now the owner of it decided to dismantle it and build something else there. But some of the old neighbors were against it, and they reported it to the authorities, saying that that was a monument to the Jewish people who had lived there. And So they sent a commission, and they realized that that not only they realized, but at the time they were building a museum of different structures which had existed in the state, the church, the old church, different structures. And so they decided to dismantle this building brick by brick and rebuild it in this museum, which is at a different location in the state. And they did that. In the year I indicated to you that we went to Nentershausen with my brothers, we also went to visit the synagogue and the museum, because after all it was the synagogue from Nentershausen. And it had been rebuilt there and still exists today for anybody who visits the museum. Not only that, but the ark which existed in each synagogue was given to a museum in Frankfurt, which actually lended to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and the ark from the synagogue from Nentershausen is in the U.S. Holocaust Museum in Washington. I visited there. I couldn't contain my crying in front of it, because all my ancestors had been in that place at some point in time. I'm very sentimental, unfortunately. So the ark from the Nentershausen synagogue is preserved now in the Holocaust Museum. There's not much more to say. That we visited the synagogue when we went with my two brothers, and it was quite an experience, to be able to stand in the same place as my parents and my grandparents had been. We were lucky in that respect, that at least a part of our town is preserved.
And in the museum in Nentershausen, how do they speak about the Jewish life in Nentershausen, or what do they show about it?
Well, it's interesting that excuse me one moment. It's interesting because there's a group of neighbors, I guess, in Nentershausen. They formed a historical society, and one of their acts was to write a story about the Jews in Nentershausen. I have a copy of the book, and it gives a historical story about how it started, when you started to live in Nentershausen, under what conditions, and so on. And over the years, it indicated what this decade there was so on, this decade there were so many Jews, and so on. Very interesting, And actually, my brother used that book as a background to write his own story about our family in Nentershausen. But the fact to have this historic document was very significant.
And when you went to see the Ark in the museum here in DC, did you went by yourself, or was it with your family, with your brothers, or?
No, I went with my wife, and I'm not sure if our kids were with us or not at that time, but it was with my wife that we were there. And it was very emotional for me.
And you mentioned that your family was really religious,
Right.
especially your parents. Are you still really religious today, or has that changed?
For me, it has changed. No, I'm a traditionalist, yes, but I don't maintain the holidays like they do, and or my parents did. No. My older brother, the one who wrote the story about the family, he is was very religious too during his entire life.
And you mentioned that your brother researched and wrote about your family's story. Have you also done research on your own experiences, or has it been mainly from what your brother has written and you all spoken about?
Yeah, just like you indicated, mainly the experience from my brother. Of course, as I said before, I do remember some things, but not that many. He researched it, and he went to talk with other members of the family. I mean, with my cousins in Israel, for example. No? And it so happened that one of my cousins had still collected or maintained the collection of letters which my parents had written to her parents in the 40s. No? So my brother was able to have a better feeling for what had happened during those years. No. And so that was a big help.
And are you involved in any Holocaust-related activities or groups?
Not specifically. No, we're members of a temple here in Highland Park. No, we follow the holidays, but not too accurately, if you understand what I mean.
And you spent a long time in Ecuador and then came to the United States. Do you still feel today, or do you feel a connection with Ecuador, or it was mainly just that period of time? And
Good question. Yes, I feel very much related to Ecuador. I grew up there. I at one point became an Ecuadorian citizen too. No, but after working here for many years, I adopted the American citizenship. No. I never felt very connected to Germany, and it's more with Ecuador and with the United States. No. So is life.
Yeah, that is life. And in what ways has your experiences during the Holocaust affected you? For example, having to leave Germany to go to Ecuador.
Well, definitely big effect. I don't know what I would be if I would have stayed in Germany. No, maybe I still would live in a little town. Maybe I would have moved to a big city. But the opportunity which Ecuador gave me is very important. Many times ask myself that question. What would have been of us if we had stayed in Germany? No. If war wouldn't have taken place, or Nazis wouldn't have come to be the voices for a time. No, but difficult to answer. But certainly I appreciate having had the opportunity to educate myself and to look for a brighter future. And that opportunity was given to me in Ecuador. Fortunately, we were able to work always to move ahead. And that's the example for my parents and my family in general. My parents were always very hard workers, and I like to leave that same impression in my kids. What can I tell you? So, yes, the Holocaust has had an impact on myself. Just for the fact that I have been successful, and I think I have done something for humanity. Even though it may be very little, but what can we say?
And have you encountered Holocaust denial?
You have to be more specific. What are you asking?
So have you heard anyone or had a situation in which someone has denied that the Holocaust happened or a similar?
Not to me personally, Well, one reads in the press that there are people who today say it never happened and so on, but I have to laugh when that is said because I know better than that. So, yes, I haven't experienced it directly, but yes, I know about it.
And what has it meant to give your testimony today?
Well, I hope that it's a testimony. Well, I shouldn't say I hope. I know it's a testimony of somebody who has lived the experience, and for certainly I wouldn't be here today if the Holocaust wouldn't have existed. It's a reality for me, certainly. So I can assure anybody who doubts that it's real or that it existed, and it changed the root of individuals, which, if it wouldn't have existed, would have finished maybe being very significant or of no significance, but it had changed we cannot define exactly in what way the change has taken place or how it affects the individual. Go ahead.
And what would you like to tell future generations who might watch your interview?
Well, that I hope the situation does not repeat itself, because it's not something which is like easy to take, and that it always consequences exist, even if they don't experience it in certain way. It repercutes to all individuals, really, because we are connected somehow between all human beings.
And is there anything else that you would like to add?
Well, that I wish that it doesn't repeat itself. I really wish that from all my heart. And
Well,
I appreciate the opportunity to give this testimony.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us today, Carlos.
My pleasure. And thank you to you for asking very clear questions. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Pleasure has been made. Tell us about these photographs.
These are my parents just before we left Germany. My father was 42 years old, my mother 35.
And and what were their names again?
Willie was my father, and Martha my mother.
And they took this right before they left, or were they this beforehand?
No, about that time we left.
Thank you. Tell me about this photograph.
And this is the house we lived in Nendershausen. This picture was taken after the Second World War, around 1950, I would say, because of the car. But in the front of the house, towards the car, that was the store where my parents sold shoes and bicycles and sewing machines, and the rest was the place we occupied for our life and at home. No, as I mentioned, also my grandfather and two grand-aunts lived in the same house. In the lower floor we had the dining room, kitchen, and the upper floor was the place where we slept. And then there was the attic, where they kept some fruits to dry and so on.
And what happened to the house after the war?
A bank purchased it, and they built a branch of a bank at this location.
Thank you so much. Tell me about these three photographs.
Well, and the first one is the synagogue from Nendershausen, but after it was used as a garage and as a warehouse, so it's in very poor condition. That's when they decided to dismantle it. And the second, the middle picture, it's the rebuilt synagogue in the freestanding museum in Hessen after it was rebuilt there. And in the third picture, that's a picture of the ark from the synagogue in Nendershausen as it appears in the Holocaust Museum. As you can notice in the top part, it's an inscription which has been defaced, who was defaced on Kristallnacht, actually, on this ark.
Thank you so much. So tell me about these photographs that we have here.
The first photograph is of my great uncle Wolf, who actually decided not to travel to Ecuador and gave his ticket to my father so that he could travel to Ecuador. After that, the picture of the boat is the Kinyomaru. That's the boat in which we went from Yokohama in Japan to Panama in Panama. And then the third picture is one of the Grace Line boats which makes the service from Panama to Guayaquil, and it would be the same type of boat we went in during our trip. The last picture is of a plane similar to the one we flew in from Königsberg in Germany at the time to Moscow in Russia. This is the plane who takes 17 passengers I mentioned earlier.
And your great uncle, what happened to him after?
Oh, he actually was able to also escape from Germany. He went a different route as we did. Somehow it appears that he was able to get to Portugal, and from Portugal he went to Cuba, to Colombia, and then by bus or by train, most likely by bus, went through Colombia to Ecuador. And he appeared at the end of 1941 in Ecuador.
So he joined you and your family in Ecuador then, and in
Right.
Quito?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Tell me about these two photos.
Okay, the first picture is a picture of the train line, a section of the train line who goes from Guayaquil to Quito, and which is known as the Nose of the Devil. It's it's a construction which is very unique in that the train has to go in zigzag. It goes first forward, then it goes backwards, but that's the only way they could build it, so that it would go up the mountains, and it's part of the trajectory you have to go during the trip from Guayaquil to Quito. It still exists today.
And the second photograph?
Oh, the second photograph, in that picture, that's during a work in the field. One of the individuals there is one of my uncles, and the other two individuals are Indians, which are working the land in order to grow produce. But that was one of the ways of opening the ground to plant something in Ecuador at the time when we got there.
And were they workers of your uncle?
No, my uncle, I don't know if he's instructing them or maybe learning how to work the land in order to grow something.
Well, thank you so much. Tell me about these two photographs.
The first one is that there's three children. Those are my brothers and myself, and together with my mother and with one of my uncles, the one who started a bakery and had his farm close to ours. This was on the very early days when we were in Ecuador. We were visiting with him, and this picture must have been taken in 1941 at some point.
Approximately how old were you in this photograph?
6 years, between 6 and 7 at the most.
And what about the second photograph?
That's my parents in the shoe store my father had in Quito, but this is quite a number of years later. This probably is around, I would say, in the late 50s, mid to late 50s.
And did his shop stay in the same location since the moment that he opened it, or did he switch places?
He had switched places.
And was your mother's noodle business near the shoe shop?
No, this was, we lived in the same house. In the front towards the main street was the store of my father. It was a corner house where we were living at that time. So in the same house, further in the back, is where we lived, and my mother prepared her noodles.
Thank you so much. Tell me about this photograph.
These are two pictures on the same photograph. They both showed the store my father had, where he is standing behind my sewing machine he had brought from Germany. And in the second picture, in the background, you can see some animal, what you call it, not leather. Well, anyway, these were skins of animals who had been dissected practically, and they were going to be used on shoes. Normally people would come from the jungle and bring him skins which had been prepared for shoemaking practically.
Oh, thank you so much. Tell me about this photograph.
These are my parents. This picture was probably taken in the mid-60s, mid to late 60s, and it shows them in their living room in Quito.
And how old, so the picture is from when they were in their 60s, you said?
No, that was taken the age probably my father probably was in his 60s, and my mother was 8 years younger than him.
Oh, thank you so much. Tell me about these 3 photographs.
Yeah, the first one, it shows us 3 brothers in 1999 in the center of Nendershausen. That tree was called Unter den Linden, and it's in the center of town. So that was during the visit. During the same visit, the next picture was taken where it shows my older brother with his wife and myself with Sandy in front of the town of Nendershausen. On the third picture, you see a lady with a child there. This picture was taken on occasion that we encountered this lady when we were looking for the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery of Nendershausen. And she asked for Bert. She had used to play with Bert when they were young. And her mother used to help my mother during preparation for holidays.
Thank you so much. Tell me about this book.
This book was written by my older brother Bert, and it is the history of the family, especially from the time of the Holocaust and what happened to all of us after. It includes stories about my uncles and also about the family who went to Israel. It includes the history of the Jews in Nendershausen.
And how long did it take Bert to write this book?
Well, about 10 years.
Thank you so much. Tell me about this book.
This book was prepared by the so-called Historical Society of Nendershausen, and the translation of the title is The Jewish Path, and it gives a history about the life of Jews in the town of Nendershausen over the years.
And the Historical Association who did this book is the same one who then created the museum?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand your last words.
Yeah. Are the creators of this book the same ones that then established the museum?
I still don't understand the word.
Did the writers of this book also make a museum?
No. They don't have anything to do with a museum. It's just a group of neighbors which are interested in history, and they decided to write something about their Jewish neighbors.
Thank you so much. Tell me about this menorah.
Well, this is one of the objects who has survived since we left Germany. This was one menorah which my parents packed to come with us to Ecuador. And I still have it today.
Was this menorah, what happened to this menorah during Kristallnacht too?
I don't know what happened to Kristallnacht. I don't know even if it was at quiet before or after, but it was taken by my parents to Ecuador.
And when did your parents give you the menorah?
Oh, maybe I inherited after they passed away. I may have taken it from whatever, from their department in Israel, and as a souvenir of our life.
And do you still use the menorah today?
Yes, not this particular one, but of course we use a menorah. No.
Thank you so much. Tell me about these two objects.
Well, the first of these items is a nutcracker, which also came with us from Germany, and I just happened to find it among other souvenirs. I took it from my parents' home in Israel. They had it. And the second object in this picture is a pair of glasses which my father used to read, and it also survived since the time we were in Germany.
Thank you so much. And with this concludes our interview.
Thank you.